Folks, I have some exciting news to share. Join me for a live podcast recording at the Imperial War Museum in London. On Saturday, October 19th, I'll be participating in the Imperial War Museum's Podcast Live Festival. At this festival, podcasters from across the UK will record episodes in front of a live audience. I'm thrilled to have been asked to record an episode of the World War II podcast there, and I'll be joined by postgraduate researcher Matthew Huff from the University of Leeds. Together, we'll discuss Harold Alexander's role as Supreme Commander in the Mediterranean during World War II. Now, this is a ticketed event, so sign up in advance to secure your spot. And after a full day of live podcast recordings at the Imperial War Museum, there will be a special panel discussion at the Churchill War Rooms. We'll explore the rise of podcasting, share how we got started, and discuss how podcasts are transforming the way we connect with history and bring it to a wider audience. I'd love to see as many of you there as possible, so for more details on tickets and event timings, visit the Imperial War Museum website, iwm.org.uk, and search Podcast Live.
This country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In April 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet was at the height of its power, having delivered a crushing blow to the US Navy at Pearl Harbor just months earlier. This fleet spearheaded Japan's aggressive expansion through Southeast Asia and unleashed havoc across the Pacific. However, the tides of war were soon to change. By June 1942, the US Navy achieved a decisive victory over this formidable force at the Battle of Midway, shifting the strategic momentum in the Pacific theatre to the Allies. Midway stands as the most renowned naval battle of the Pacific War and one of the most storied in military history. The traditional narrative, shaped immediately after the conflict and enduring to this day, portrays an outnumbered American fleet snatching victory against overwhelming odds. While this depiction has become deeply ingrained, it oversimplifies the true nature of the battle. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me is Pacific War expert Mark Stilley, whose new book is Midway, the Pacific War's most famous battle, where he contends that a Japanese defeat was not only possible, but likely. This perspective redefines the engagement not as a miraculous American triumph or mere stroke of luck, but as a complex confrontation where the factors at play heavily favoured the United States. It's nice to see you again, Mark. Let's start by setting the scene. By spring 1941, the Japanese had expanded into the Pacific, taking the Philippines, Borneo, Java, the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts. But Yamamoto wanted to push further towards Hawaii to take New Caledonia, Fiji, the Aleutians, and Midway. Why?
Yeah, that's a very complex question, and we got to do a little bit of background first because Yamamoto was a unique player during this period of the war. As we all know, he's the commander of the Combined Fleet, but he was attempting to usurp the power from the Naval General Staff to be the arbiter for Japanese naval strategy. So normally, the Naval General Staff would set strategy, and then Yamamoto would plan the operation as commander of the Combined Fleet, but that's not how he saw things as working. So at this point in the war, after the Japanese achieved what they called their first operational phase objectives, then Yamamoto wanted to press on further into the Central Pacific. His focus was on the Central Pacific, and that was mainly to draw the U.S. fleet into what he hoped would be a decisive battle. So this whole notion of decisive battles was deep in Japanese Navy DNA. So they had practiced this pre-war, spent a lot of time thinking about it, and Yamamoto essentially tried to do that at Pearl Harbor, and he wanted to finish off the Pacific Fleet by mounting this Midway operation. At the same time, though, the Naval General Staff wanted to go south and cut off the slocks between Australia and the United States. So There was a great rivalry there, and I'm sure, as we'll talk about later, they came to a fatal compromise. But Yamamoto's idea was to destroy the Pacific Fleet, and from there, he could do any number of things. He did look at an invasion of Hawaii, though the record would seem to indicate that he thought that was going to be too hard. But he did see that there was no point cutting the slocks by going south. He could do so much easier, he thought, by simply destroying the U.S. fleet. And at that point, the slocks would be undefended. There's also some notion that he had that once he destroyed the U.S. fleet, that the U.S. would be forced to sue for peace. So this is what he was thinking at the time. These weren't always realistic notions that he had, but he was laser focused on destroying the U.S. fleet.
The Japanese idea of the decisive battle, does that come from the Japanese-Russia war? Did they have a decisive battle against the Russians? Is that where it all springs from?
It primarily does, absolutely does, right. So the Japanese were usually the inferior fleet, like the war against the Russians, like the war against the Americans. And so how does a smaller fleet beat the bigger one? Well, a decisive battle. And it worked once, and we're going to make it work again.
Yes, sent shockwaves through. So you make a point about Pearl Harbor being a strategic failure. Now, in 1942, we also have had the Indian Ocean raid. I think it's April, isn't it? And then the Battle of Coral Sea the following month. I just wondered had the Japanese learned anything from these actions? Whilst we're thinking of Japanese successes, that sounds like almost like a potentially string of failures.
I mean, it was a mixed bag. I mean, Pearl Harbor was obviously a strategic failure for the Japanese. And again, the key player in this is Yamamoto. He was the driving force behind it. Without him, there would have been no Pearl Harbor attack. But even though he's given credit for having this insight into the American psyche because he lived in America for a short time, his attack on Pearl Harbor undermined his unrealistic notion that he could make the U.S. sue for peace. So on that basis, it was clearly a strategic failure. It was also an operational failure because they sank a lot of old ships, but it did very, very little, perhaps nothing, to impact the Pacific Fleet's capability. So Pearl Harbor was very much an underachieving action for the Japanese. But the Indian Ocean raid is very interesting. It was kind of irrelevant in the big scheme of things. The Japanese would have been better served to use that time differently and better by pursuing either the southern option that the Naval General Staff wanted to do, or by doing the Central Pacific offensive that Yamamoto wanted to do. So they decided to take the carrier fleet, and this is a striking force under an officer named Nagumo. So they took the striking force and they went into the Indian Ocean trying to cripple the British Eastern Fleet, primarily to cover the movement of forces into Burma. So it didn't achieve that goal. But if you look at the Indian Ocean raid, it's a remarkable action because it was a virtual dress rehearsal for Midway. There wasn't much of a battle there to speak of, but there almost was. It almost was the first carrier battle in history, but its so many aspects were eerily similar to what happened in Midway. And we'll just go through a couple of those. The Japanese had a bad plan, and they had bad assumptions, just like they had in Midway. The Allied code breakers gave the British commanders notice the Japanese were coming, just like what happened in Midway. And tactically, the Japanese didn't conduct a very robust search program, so they were surprised, just like at Midway. Just like at Midway, Nagumo had competing priorities. He had to strike land targets while also being on tap to react to naval forces, just like what happened in Midway. And also in the Indian Ocean, there was an unexpected arrival of Allied naval ships that the Japanese were slow to react to. Sounds familiar, just like in Midway. And also at Indian Ocean, there was the first air attack ever on the striking force, and it wasn't a large strike, but the Japanese were surprised. So Japanese made a lot of mistakes in the Indian Ocean, but the British didn't have the power to make them pay for it. But it was much different, of course, at Midway. And you mentioned Coral Sea. That was a very important battle, not because it was the first carrier battle, which it was, but it had a lot of implications for what happened in Midway the next month. So It was a strategic defeat for the Japanese because their invasion of Port Moresby was stopped, but because they sank a large U.S. carrier and the Americans only sank a small Japanese carrier, the battle goes down in history as a tactical victory for the Japanese. But the opposite is true. It was a tactical defeat for the Japanese. The Japanese had three carriers in the operation, two of the fleet carriers from the striking force. And after the operation, all three were out of action, either sunk, damaged, or in the case of one of these fleet carriers, its air wing was severely damaged. So the Japanese were so overconfident, they made no real effort to get it back in operation for the Midway operation. So before Coral Sea, the Japanese had a big advantage in fleet carriers. And after Coral Sea, they lost that carrier advantage. So going into Midway, the balance of the all-important fleet carriers, four for the Japanese and three for the Americans, making this a pretty even fight.
Had they learned anything from these actions, though?
They learned the importance of reconnaissance, which was an obvious important aspect of carrier warfare before the battle was fought. But the Japanese fought this with the two carriers of the 5th Carrier Division, and these were the new carriers in the striking force, and they were kind of sanguine about that. Well, the 5th Carrier Division did a pretty good job, and they're the rookies, so we'll have no problem in another carrier battle with our more veteran carriers. So, but there wasn't really a lot of time to implement any of the lessons learned between Coral Sea and Midway. They were fought so close together.
So how did Yamamoto, when he's thinking about his decisive battle at Midway, how did Yamamoto envisage the plan playing out?
He was going to fight this as a decisive battle. So he used a lot of the Japanese pre-war planning for a decisive battle when he made his own plans for Midway. His plan for Midway, it must be said, was utterly, totally atrocious. And that's across the board. So this decisive battle was going to be a set piece battle with almost the entire strength of the combined fleet. And they made a lot of assumptions here, as the Japanese were prone to do in their operational planning, and they were quite bad. So on day one, they're going to show up. They're going to gain strategic surprise. The Americans will not know that we're coming. We're going to strike Midway with an air raid and knock it out in one day. And then on the next day, we're going to take the island with this landing force. That takes one day. And then one day after that, we're going to prepare Midway as a base. And then after that, the Americans are going to be lured out of Pearl Harbor, and they're going to essentially steam into our trap. So Yamamoto did not want to divulge his entire strength to the Americans because he wanted them to come out and fight. So he had this rather elaborate scheme where he would have a lure off Midway. The Americans would come out to destroy this force, and then the entirety of the combined fleet would converge and destroy the Americans. And of note, this plan included a large role for the battleships. So Yamamoto has been given credit for being this air power advocate, this far-seeing advocate of naval air power, and that's true to a degree. But here's a case in point where his decisive battle plan was at points battleship-centric still.
He's working on a tremendous amount of assumptions on what the Americans are going to do. How much intelligence did he have to base those assumptions on?
In a nutshell, he had no intelligence to make these assumptions. And we talked about a couple of the assumptions: strategic surprise, tactical surprise, a single strike to knock out Midway, take Midway in a day, and the Americans will steam into our trap. These are all important assumptions for the plan. They all have implications later on in the battle that we'll see. But the Japanese didn't really practice intelligence. They didn't really give much importance to intelligence. They would bend intelligence to suit their operational planning. It should be done the other way around. Intelligence should drive operational planning, like the Americans let happen off of Midway. But there was no intelligence. In fact, what intelligence they did have suggested that the Americans were ready for something at Midway. Another case in point, for their tactical surprise assumption, well, they knew that the Americans were flying long-range search aircraft off of Midway, that there were a large number of aircraft flying off of Midway. So why would you assume then, if you knew this, which they did, that you would gain tactical surprise? It just makes no sense. I mean, even in the Indian Ocean, a month or two earlier, the Japanese striking force was detected early by a British flying boat. So it had happened before, but they just couldn't get their mind around that the Americans were ready for them. There was zero intelligence to base these assumptions on, and it cost them dearly.
We've also got to factor in that, as you say, it's all right coming up with a plan, but the enemy never stands still. They're not passive. They don't work to your plans. How much did Nimitz and the US Navy know of the Japanese intentions?
Well, as we all know, anybody who's read about the battle, that Nimitz knew a lot about the Japanese plan, and that's true. So Nimitz, though, had the courage to accept the intelligence that he was given, and he acted on it. So he acted very boldly. So Midway's been called a victory of intelligence, and that's a bit of an exaggeration because intelligence, of course, doesn't guarantee victory. You have to fight the battle still. But intel did set up the victory that the Americans gained off Midway. So the intelligence that he had was quite good, but it was not definitive. So he and his staff had to fill in the gaps there so they could make an operational plan to mount this ambush of the Japanese invasion force. So he had a very good idea of the order of battle of the Japanese, pretty exact idea of the order of battle of the striking force. He didn't know all the aspects of the Japanese force at Midway, but like, for example, he didn't know that the Japanese had brought all their battleships to the fight, but this didn't matter. They weren't in the fight. Between the intel he was given and the assumptions that he made, the gaps that he filled in, they had a very close idea of the time and the location of the strike force when it began to attack Midway. And he also knew that there would be a concurrent Aleutians landing with Midway. So they did make a couple of bad assumptions, which turned out to be a factor later in the battle. But for the most part, he had an extremely good idea of what was going to happen off Midway.
The Aleutian operations were meant as a distraction, partly, weren't they? Did the Americans ever get distracted by the Aleutian operation?
That is one of the myths of Midway. The Aleutians was not a distraction operation. In fact, it makes no sense to think they were because Yamamoto was trying to draw the Americans to Midway, not lure them somewhere else. So it was all part of this compromise that Yamamoto was forced to make with the Naval General Staff. The pre-war plans called for seizing points in the Aleutians. So the Naval General Staff saw this as an opportunity to seize those points. So that was included in the operation. So that's why it was there. It was in no way meant to be a diversion from Midway. Yeah, it was a distraction to the Japanese because it drained off forces from their main attacks. They had 50 odd ships going up to the Aleutians, to include 2 carriers. This was not a prudent move because if you fight a carrier battle off Midway and you lose the carrier battle, you cannot hold your newly occupied islands in the Aleutians. If you win the carrier battle off Midway, then you can take anything you want in the Aleutians. So both sides put a lot of ships up there for no real reason.
Interesting phrase, carrier battle, yet Yamamoto's bringing a lot of battleships. Did Nimitz envisaged it being a carrier battle? Had he moved his mental space to thinking of as a carrier battle rather than a traditional naval battle where ships are physically firing at one another?
The Americans had totally made that mental shift, and well, they were forced to, right? Because on Pearl Harbor Day, the battle line wasn't knocked out. It's false to say that, but it was evident from day one of the war that this was going to be a carrier war and not a battleship war. The Americans had rebuilt their battle line by the time of Midway, and they had 6 battleships operational in June 1942. Because of several factors, they weren't operating out of Pearl Harbor. They were operating out of the west coast. But Nimitz gave them no role in this fight whatsoever. So he knew that this was going to be a carrier battle, and he planned accordingly. So it was totally a carrier battle as far as he was concerned. But there were other aspects of his plan that were important. He was a submariner. That's his background. So he thought a lot of the capabilities of American submarines. So that was a big part of the battle in his pre-war planning. And a big part of the battle was also air power based on Midway. So Nimitz gave these aircraft an important mission to attrit the Japanese carrier force before the carrier battle took place. But more importantly, these long-range aircraft based on Midway were important because they could find the Japanese first and therefore set up his carrier ambush.
Oh, it's going to be my next question. So essentially, Nimitz has turned the ambush round on the Japanese, hasn't he? Is his basic plan?
Right, because he had this exquisite intelligence, so he was able to set up this. In fact, there were 5 carrier battles in the war, and there was only one ambush during those 5 carrier battles, and this is it. It was a very unique set of circumstances.
Did Yamamoto? I mean, he's got a very prescribed plan. Does he have any plan B, plan C for any friction? What happens in Yamamoto's plan? What would have happened? Did he have it written down? What if the Americans, heavens alive, turned up a day early or 2 days early, or was it all going to be by timetable?
Yamamoto's plan was very strict, and there was a timetable. We talked about the assumptions here that he had, and there was no allowance for friction. He kind of put Nagumo, the commander of the striking force, in a box because he had to conduct the Midway strike to prepare it for invasion. Then he had to cover the invasion. So he had to be ready to do 2 things at once, mount the invasion and then counter any American force that might show up. So his plan was very bad in that regard. It only allowed for the Americans to act according to the script that he had set up for them. And if they went off script, there are going to be some big problems. And of course, that's what happened.
Mark, we're going to pause it there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Mark Stilley, and we're discussing the Battle of Midway. That first day, presumably, the Japanese don't need to look for the Americans because, according to their script, they're not there. Are they both sending out rampant patrols to try and find each other, or are the Japanese not expecting it?
Well, that's where these assumptions come into play, because we talked about their assumption that they were going to gain strategic and tactical surprise. And if that's the case, then why would you have to mount a robust search plan for carriers that weren't going to be there? So on the first day of the battle, the key day on the 4th of June, the Japanese do mount searches off their carriers with their float planes off their escorts for the most part. But overall, the search plan was very weak. And the guy that came up with it admitted this after the war. So it was a very poor effort to find the enemy. But if he's not going to be there, it should suffice. Well, it didn't suffice. The Americans have put a lot more into their search plan because this whole ambush is set up with the notion that they're going to find the Japanese first. And they had a big advantage here because they had over 30 long-range patrol aircraft based on Midway. And they're flying 700 nautical miles out from Midway. And that's a much larger search range than either Japanese or American carrier aircraft have. So that's what happens on this first day. The PBY Catalinas from Midway find the Japanese first. And the Japanese search plan proves to be a failure. However, in a quirk of fortune, people think that the Americans were the luckiest of the combatants off of Midway, but that's not always true. Like, for example, on the morning of the 4th of June, one of the few Japanese search aircraft out there breaks off its search pattern early, goes off script, and only then does it come across the American carrier force. So if this search plane had stayed on his track, he wouldn't have found anything, and the Japanese would be none the wiser that there were Americans there at all. But through a quirk of fortune, they did find the Americans on the morning of 4th of June.
If we look at the sequencing, am I right in saying that the Japanese have launched their first strike on Midway before the Catalinas find the Japanese strike force?
Yeah, there's a lot going on the morning of 4th of June. It's a very busy morning for both sides. But the first important occurrence is when one of these Catalinas finds the Japanese carriers at about 5:30. At that point, Midway launches all of its strike aircraft, and they arrive at the area, the Japanese striking force, and they attack throughout the morning. So before that occurred, though, the Japanese did launch their large strike against Midway. That's the timeline. Japanese launched their strike first, but it's aimed at Midway, and then they're found by the American strike aircraft.
And how effective was that strike? Because in some way, Midway could be quite key because it's essentially an unsinkable battleship is Midway. It could have been incredibly key, all those planes on Midway. How decisive was the Japanese strike on Midway?
Well, it didn't go according to their assumptions. That's true. They launched this very large strike, 108 aircraft, with the notion that they're going to catch all these American aircraft on the ground and knock out Midway's air power. And as we just discussed, that didn't happen. The Americans got wind of the Japanese carrier force and its location, and they launched a strike aircraft first. But after the strike aircraft get off, then this Japanese strike does hit Midway. It's hard to knock out a well-developed base like Midway was at this point with one strike. So surprisingly enough, it was not capable of knocking out Midway, and it was obvious to the Japanese that this was the case. So the commander of the Japanese strike radios back to Nagumo, we need a second strike to finish the job. And that sets up this chain of events that we'll talk about, I'm sure. But Midway was a very important player here in this battle. Not only did its aircraft find the Japanese carriers, but they inflicted a lot of losses on the Japanese strike. 108 aircraft took part in the strike, and it's little known how much damage was inflicted by Midway on the Japanese aircraft. 11 aircraft were lost or forced to ditch. 14 were heavily damaged and couldn't fly again. So right there, that's a quarter of the strike force. And then on top of that, there were 29 more that had some lighter damage. So about half the strike force was damaged or shot down. That's horrible attrition. And as fortune would have it, some of the key units that took part in this Midway strike were involved in the carrier battle later in the day, but they were heavily attrited by Midway. So Midway did play an important role in the battle.
The Japanese had 248 planes, so you're almost looking at 29.
Well, the Japanese did have about half their aircraft allocated to this big Midway strike, but they kept a little bit larger force back as the reserve force. And that's the force that Nagumo has to use to either strike Midway again, as his strike commander told him she should do, or to be ready to counter an American naval force.
Well, this is where the key decision of the day, presumably, is Nagumo's second strike on Midway with the reserve force. Why does this decision prove to be so decisive?
Well, this was the key point in the battle. There were two key points in the battle, and both took place on the morning of 4th of June. The first one, we should talk about that briefly as well. So the Catalinas find the Japanese carrier force. Word does not get back to the American commanders on the carriers at that moment. It takes a while. So there's two key American commanders in the battle. One is Admiral Fletcher, who is on carrier Yorktown. That's Task Force 17. Fletcher is in charge of this battle. It's not Spruance, but Fletcher is in charge of the overall American force at Midway. And then that second important American commander is Admiral Spruance. He's commander of Task Force 16, which has two carriers, Hornet and Enterprise. So these are the forces that are going to carry out Nimitz's ambush. Once they get word of the location of the Japanese carriers, they have to conduct this strike to knock them out. Spruance has a key decision to make. He gets word late of the location of the Japanese carriers. And when he gets this word and they plot out the location, they're a little bit too far to make a safe strike from their current location. So he decides not to strike immediately, which you would think would be all important in a carrier battle. You got to strike first, but he decides to wait. He steams towards Japanese force, and he decides to launch a strike at 7 o'clock. So that momentary delay is important because it makes the strike feasible. Had he launched right away, it would have been a mess. It was already a mess as the way it turned out, but it would have been even more of a mess, even more unfeasible had he launched right away, because the location reported by the search aircraft was inaccurate. It was actually farther away from the carriers than he realized. And then at 8:30, Fletcher launches his aircraft at the Japanese carrier force. So that's the first key decision in the battle. The Americans wait for a while, but they do get their big strike in the air against the Japanese. But then the second major decision point is on the Japanese side. So Nagumo has to decide how to use his reserve force. And this is a very difficult situation because he's put in a very difficult position. He has this second wave of aircraft on his carrier decks that Yamamoto has told him, because after the Indian Ocean raid, when they were surprised by the appearance of these British ships, Yamamoto orders him to keep a reserve force ready to respond to a naval force. So this is where things stand when this Japanese search plane wanders across the American carrier force. This happens after the strike on Midway. So at this point, Nagumo is already preparing to use his reserve force, the one that's armed against surface ships. He's going to rearm them with land attack weapons and attack Midway. But this is when he gets the first report that there are ships in the area. Now, it takes the Japanese search aircraft quite a while to refine this report to actually indicate that there's a carrier in this force. So when this finally happens, Nagumo was in a real fix because he has a real threat in the area here. An American carrier has been sighted. So that's his first objective. So he stops the rearming of the reserve force with land bombs. Now he has to rearm them again with weapons to attack ships. And this takes a while, obviously. The Japanese aren't flexible here because what Nagumo should have done with 20/20 hindsight is launch what he had ready at the time to mount an immediate strike against this emergent threat, the American carrier that has been sighted. But that's not Japanese doctrine. Japanese doctrine is you mount a massive strike, you mount a coordinated strike with torpedo planes and dive bombers, which they were very good at, but that's how you do it, and that's how you gain a decisive blow against the enemy. But just like he showed off Ceylon in the Indian Ocean, Nagumo was not a flexible commander. He didn't have imagination, whereas he could have found a window of time to mount an immediate strike against the American carrier. He decided not to do that. He's going to rearm his aircraft, recover his strike aircraft from Midway, and then launch this massive strike against the American carrier force. But by this time, of course, it was too late because the American strike force was already in the air and headed towards the Japanese carrier force. So Nagumo had lost control of the battle by this point.
The outcome of this first American strike, is successful, but it's an incredibly mixed bag when you start breaking down how successful some planes were. So what happened? Because some planes never arrive. What happened in that wave? Well, it's not even a wave, is it?
No, it's a series of uncoordinated strikes. And thrown in there, of course, are these strike aircraft from Midway. So the first ones to attack Japanese carriers with a strike aircraft from Midway. And these weren't constant attacks. They did occur throughout the morning, and they weren't successful from the standpoint that they didn't gain any hits on the Japanese carriers, but they did tie down Nagumo. So we talk about how he should have done this immediate strike, but it's always more complicated than simply saying, hey, he should have done this or that. He was under a constant attack in the morning from aircraft, first from Midway, and then later on from the American carriers. So the American carriers launched this massive strike and torpedo bombers were in there, dive bombers in there, and with fighter escort. Whereas the Japanese were very good at keeping their strike formations together to mount a coordinated strike, the Americans couldn't do this. So this is what happened on the morning of the 4th of June. The carrier strike broke up for various reasons. The first to attack were the torpedo bombers by themselves, unsupported by the dive bombers. So they go in first, the ones from Hornet and the ones from Enterprise. And these are slow, vulnerable aircraft. Japanese can concentrate on them, and the torpedo bombers take very, very heavy losses. In the meantime, the dive bombers from Hornet were on a total mission to nowhere, as it has often been called. They were a non-factor in the battle, but the key squadrons were the dive bomber squadrons, 2 of them, from Enterprise. And they were commanded by a very capable officer, a guy named McCluskey. And they, after wandering around south of the Japanese carriers, they're at the point where they almost had to consider going back for fuel, but they did sight a Japanese ship that was headed back, so McCluskey thought, to make a rendezvous with the Japanese carriers. They followed this ship, they headed north, and they found the Japanese carriers at the precise time when they're most vulnerable. And while this is happening, Yorktown, and if you recall, they launched their aircraft later than the big strike from TF-16, Hornet and Enterprise. So at the same time, to the north of the Japanese carrier force, Yorktown's dive bombers show up. So at the key moment in the battle, the Americans have achieved a coordinated strike. They have dive bombers from Enterprise from the south, from Yorktown from the north. Also, the torpedo bombers were still in this fight from Yorktown at this time as well. So that's when the battle was decided, when the American dive bombers show up over top of the Japanese carrier force, unnoticed by the Japanese.
They managed to hit 3 out of 4 carriers. Are the Americans lucky? Why did these attacks prove to be fatal?
For several reasons. The Japanese carriers, like we had just talked about, were in the process of rearming their aircraft. So they have all their aircraft are in the hangar decks. Japanese carriers had 2 hangar decks, and many of these are refueled aircraft with their ordnance aboard. So at this point of the battle, we're talking just after 10 o'clock here, getting on to 10:30 when the attack actually takes place. But at this point, the Japanese had ordnance strewn about the hangar decks on their carriers. The aircraft were fueled. They weren't on the flight deck yet, like some accounts of the battle have it. They were still on the hangar deck. So they were very vulnerable at this point. And the American dive bombers carry 1,000-pound bombs. These are big bombs, and carrier flight decks at this point in the war, well, for the entire war for the most part, are not armored. So if you can get 1,000-pound bomb into a carrier, it's going to penetrate down to the hangar decks where all these fueled aircraft are located. It's going to cause a conflagration that the Japanese were not able to stop. And the Japanese just weren't, it's not that they weren't well trained for damage control, but they didn't have the same emphasis on damage control as the Americans did. So once these immense fires start, they cannot be stopped. And all 3 carriers were fatally damaged, and they sank. Well, 2 of them sank that day, 1 sank the next day. And this is true even with the Kagi. Like you said, she was only hit by a single bomb, but the bomb hits in the worst possible location for the Japanese, penetrates down to the hangar decks, and ignites an immense fire from the aircraft below. But this was the problem with the striking force. The Japanese didn't have a well-developed air defense capability. And once you get some dive bombers over a Japanese carrier, it was only a matter of time before it was damaged or sunk. It would be damaged if the Japanese were ready for it and had all the ordnance stowed away safely and the aircraft were not fueled on the hangar decks. But if that was the case, this damage was likely going to be fatal. And that's what happened to all 3 carriers sunk in this one attack during the morning.
They were all dive bomber attacks that succeed, aren't they?
Yeah, the torpedo planes were quite brave. and they pressed their attacks very bravely. And many of those were able to actually launch torpedoes against the Japanese carriers, but they scored no hits. So this was all done by dive bombers. In fact, when it came to the carrier battle, all the hits were scored by dive bombers. There were no hits scored by any of the aircraft on Midway. This was all the work of the carrier-based dive bombers.
The Japanese do manage to get in a counterattack, don't they, on the Yorktown with 18 dive bombers, 6 zeros. But they're spotted 30 miles out on the American radar. Presumably Yorktown has time to get up its air patrol to intercept. But what goes wrong for Yorktown? Why? Because it doesn't seem like a very big incoming force. 18 dive bombers and 6 zeros. Why is Yorktown not able to fend them off?
This was an elite squadron of dive bombers off carrier Hiryu. So we talked about the tactical excellence of the Japanese earlier on, and this is a case in point. So the Americans had a big advantage in fleet air defense because they had radar, but radar was still a newfangled instrument, and they were still trying to figure out how to use it, but more importantly, how to integrate it into their doctrine for fighter interception. So on this occasion, they did have a combat air patrol up, and they were able to vector it towards the Japanese, and they were pretty successful. There were eight, like you said, 18 dive bombers in this unit. Only 7 were actually left to attack Yorktown. So that's a good performance by the fighter interceptors. But these 7 dive bombers made the most of what they had. 3 scored direct hits and 2 scored damaging near misses. So a very good performance by the Japanese aviators. Very heavy damage to Yorktown. The ship lost power. There was a lot of smoke, and from the attack, they hit the ship on the island and blew out the boilers. So there was the appearance of very heavy damage to the ship. So when the Japanese aviators left the scene, they reported that this ship was crippled. It could have been a lot worse, though. There were a number of fueled and armed dive bombers on the hangar deck, but only one was caught in a fire, and the Americans were able to use their fire suppression system to put the fire out on the hangar deck. So unlike on the Japanese carriers, damage control on Yorktown was pretty good. And within 70 minutes, she was back in action. She had 3 boilers back up, and she was capable of 19 knots. So when the second Japanese strike shows up, all that they see is not a crippled carrier on fire. What they see is a carrier underway. So when they spot Yorktown, they thought she was an attacked carrier, and she's attacked again by the second Japanese strike.
What amazes me is that she's hit 3 times in that first strike, and they, unlike the Japanese carriers, somehow she manages to get herself moving again. But she's hit. Is she hit one more time? Is on the second strike?
Well, the second strike was the most effective one because, dive bombers are useful strike aircraft, but they don't usually, unless there's a situation like Japanese experience where you have ordnance and fueled aircraft in your hangar decks, usually dive bombers are not going to inflict fatal damage, but torpedo aircraft can do that. So the second strike is the Hiryu torpedo squadron. And we talked about the strike in against Midway. The Hiryu torpedo squadron took heavy damage in that first strike. So instead of 18 aircraft attacking Yorktown, only 10 aircraft were left to attack. And one of these was a refugee from Akagi, actually. So only half of the Hiryu torpedo aircraft are available for this strike on Yorktown. But again, these are very well-trained pilots, and they have a reliable torpedo, unlike on the American torpedo bombers. So it's a real threat. And on this occasion, the American fighter interception does not go very well. They're out of position. They don't react fast enough. And 9 of the 10 torpedo bombers survive the cap to attack Yorktown. And the second group, there are 5 of them, and they gained 2 torpedo hits. And these turned out to be fatal hits. They knock out the engine room. There's no hope of repair. So Yorktown is left dead in the water. It's a very good performance by a small number of Japanese torpedo aircraft, and that's from one squadron. So imagine if Nagumo had been able to launch all four of his squadrons, his four carriers, and hit the American carrier force. It would have been a much different battle, obviously.
How you'd managed to avoid being hit in that first strike? Had the Americans known where she was, or has she just been lucky and not been spotted? Because there is a strike on her now, isn't there?
She was out of sight when they came in the morning. There about 10:30 or so. So that's why she survived the battle. That's why she survived the morning strike and was able to launch these retaliatory strikes in the early afternoon.
At what point did the Americans pick up her location?
Well, that's another example of how much more flexible the Americans were in the battle. So Hiryu was sighted in the afternoon at about 2:30 or so in the afternoon. It's important to realize that the Americans only got 2 contact reports during the entire battle that were of any significance. One was the morning report from the Catalinas on the Japanese main carrier force. And then in the afternoon, Yorktown had launched her scout squadron to look for the other Japanese carrier. They knew that there was at least one more carrier out there. They had hit 3 in the morning, and they knew, well, of course, they had just been hit by a Japanese carrier aircraft, so they knew there was still another undamaged Japanese carrier out there. So one of the junior officers, on his own initiative, plays a hunch from this afternoon search and goes looking for Hiryu, and he's the guy who finds Hiryu. So he sent out the report, and based on that, the Americans were able to put together a strike force of 25 dive bombers from Enterprise, and they're the ones that hit Hiryu about 5 o'clock or so in the afternoon. And for the 4th time in the day, a Japanese carrier is surprised. So the Japanese, in this case, did have fighter aircraft aloft on combat air patrol, but they missed the approach of this 25 dive bomber formation. So they attack Hiryu, they gain 4 hits, and they knock out the last Japanese carrier in the striking force.
It's remarkable. So as Darkness falls, the Japanese have lost 4 carriers. The Americans, well, at this point, they haven't quite lost Yorktown. She's been abandoned. Did Nagumo think he was beaten? Did Spruance realise the victory that he had? Did they realise what had happened, the importance of the day?
Yeah, Nagumo was under no illusion there. Well, that's not true. He was under an illusion that he could retrieve the battle, but he knew that he was beaten. He had a plan to retrieve victory from the jaws of defeat with a night action. So he sent his force, most of his force anyhow, which included a couple of battleships and 2 heavy cruisers, to the east, trying to bring the American carrier force into a night surface battle, which would have been to the Japanese advantage. But Spruance was too clever to fall into that trap. He sailed to the east, and the Japanese never came close to a night action with the Americans. So he was fully aware that he was beaten. And in fact, he had a number of reports from his scouts during the day. And at one point in the day, he decided that the Americans had 5 aircraft carriers in the battle. So he really had, which he changed later on to 4, but that was still too high, obviously. But he never really did understand the kind of battle he was fighting.
In which case, did Nimitz and Spruance, were they lucky at Midway?
Well, certainly they were lucky, but fortune is a part of war. But that's not what won the battle for the Americans. But Spruance was quite clear that they did have fortune on their side on the 4th of June, and he admitted as much after the war. He said that we were riddled with luck. So that is true, because the American strike turned into a shambles, and it was fragmented. Most of Hornet's aircraft never attacked anything. It had the potential to be a total disaster, but through the initiative of McCluskey, and Yorktown's air group was very good. They planned this out very well, and they mounted a coordinated strike on the Japanese carrier force. But at the key moment in the battle, like we mentioned, the Americans had this well-coordinated strike, which overwhelmed the Japanese. The Japanese air defense system could not deal with a multi-directional attack, and that's exactly what happened at about 10:30 on the 4th of June. So from that standpoint, the Americans were quite fortunate that the strike aircraft finally found the Japanese. But the real reasons for the Japanese defeat are much deeper than that. I mean, when you have a bad plan like they had, you set yourself up for defeat. I mean, case in point, the Japanese were outnumbered in this battle. So they brought the entire combined fleet to the fight. And on paper, it was a much larger force than the Americans. But at the point of contact where the battle took place, the Americans had more aircraft and more ships. So bad plan results in bad things usually. And bad leadership, when it mattered most, is going to be even more important. And Nagumo made some questionable decisions. You can always defend him for what he did because he played it by the book, but that just wasn't good enough in this very dynamic situation. And the Japanese had very bad air defense capabilities. So they were surprised not once, not twice, not three times, but all four carriers were surprised on the morning of the 4th of June, and all were sunk by air attack. So that's why they lost the battle, not because of bad luck. And we talked about sometimes the Japanese had fortune on their side, like when this wayward search aircraft found the Americans. So it wasn't bad luck or good luck from one side only.
Finally, how did the Battle of Midway shape the subsequent strategy and operations in the Pacific? Is the boat on the other foot? Are the Americans now? Were the Americans now the dominant carrier force?
No, that's another myth of the battle. I mean, Midway is touted as the decisive battle of the Pacific War, and that term decisive battle is used a lot. It's misused, it's inaccurately used, but it wasn't the decisive battle of the Pacific War. It certainly was a turning point because it did blunt a Japanese offensive power. But for example, after the battle, the Japanese still had, on paper, a bigger carrier force than the Americans, and Japanese aviator losses were rather light at Midway. They weren't all killed. So these highly trained aviators, for the most part, survived the battle. And there were two more carrier battles in 1942. And at one of these, in October, the Battle of Santa Cruz, which was almost as big as Midway in terms of the number of carriers involved. So at the Battle of Santa Cruz, the Japanese thrashed the Americans. It's the only clear Japanese victory in a carrier battle during the entire war. So I don't see how you can call Midway decisive if after a few months later, the Japanese carrier force that was crippled supposedly in the battle was able to beat the Americans. But Midway did lead to the Guadalcanal campaign. So as the Japanese were trying to figure out what to do after their defeat at Midway, the Americans weren't waiting around. So they grabbed the initiative, and that's when they attacked this place called Guadalcanal in the Southern Solomons, trying to protect the Slox from Australia, from the U.S. to Australia. So that set up the prolonged battle off of Guadalcanal, which I submit was much more decisive than Midway because it was a much more painful battle than Midway for the Japanese.
Well, we'll have to get you back to talk about Guadalcanal at some point, Mark. Thanks. Loyal listener, if you would like to read Mark's book, Midway, I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, as a fan of the World War II podcast, I'm sure you would want to enhance your listening experience, so why not consider becoming a patron? By joining the patron community at patreon.com/WW2podcast, you can enjoy advert-free listening, allowing you to immerse yourself fully in each episode. But that's not all. Patrons also get exclusive access to extra unreleased content. These bonus bits delve deeper into topics covered and sometimes not covered. Your support on Patreon helps me keep the podcast running and growing, enabling me to bring you even more high quality content without interruptions. So if you're ready for an ad-free, richer experience, visit patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's all for this episode. Next time, I think we're on the Eastern Front. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.